Listen close. This is the kind of promise war steals. If I had to give you one warning before I begin, it's this. Wars don't just take boys in uniforms. They take whole futures. Saturday afternoons you thought you'd spend married, the silly arguments you never got to have, the quiet breakfasts that you thought would be endless. Wars steal those things and rename them sacrifice. They dress loss up in uniforms and telegrams, then deliver it to your doorstep like a parcel you never wanted. Do you hear that? That hollow thud? It's the sound of a promise being folded away. My name is Evelyn Mae Carter. I live in Booneville now, half of most of my life, and if you stay with me, I'll tell you everything. The childhood promise that grew into a love, the rose pressed between the pages of my book that still carries the faintest whisper of his hands, the letters that smelled of jungle mud and pencil shavings, the dock where we said goodbye, the telegram that ended everything, and the silence that followed me for years. I am telling it in my own voice because it's mine. Because I think a story sounds different when the person who lived it is talking to you, not reading from a script. So sit down. Put the kettle on if you must. I'll wait. I won't hurry. That's the thing about some memories. They need to be tasted slowly.
Chapter 1. The Promise. Booneville, Summers of My Childhood. Booneville in June smelled like magnolia blossoms and cut grass. The streets were small and the people even smaller, stitched into each other's lives like the seams of my grandmother's quilts. The bell above the pharmacy door rang the same tune every day. The world outside our little town felt like rumor. I was 9 years old when Aunt Loretta leaned across her parlor chair, her silver hair catching the sunlight through lace curtains, and said, "Evelyn, you'll marry my boy one day." She said it like a fact, not a question. In our town, promises were handed down like recipes, quietly, firmly, and without asking if you liked the taste. His name was Michael Lawson, though everyone called him Mike. He had freckles the color of cinnamon and a gap between his two front teeth that made him grin like he was saving something funny for later. He already had a swagger that didn't belong to him yet. He had been Aunt Loretta's boy since he came home from the hospital wrapped in a yellow blanket. For me, he was some kind of familiar story, a name threaded into family dinners and the holiday toasts. When you're 9, you're more interested in marbles than in futures. I kept my marbles in a little tin and thought promises were like marbles, beautiful and round and meant for play. At 9, I thought more about marbles and hopscotch than marriage. But promises are like seeds. You don't always notice when they've been planted, but one day you wake up and find they've grown roots. We grew together, 2 children chasing fireflies, 2 teenagers daring each other to jump from the rope swing into the river. I still remember the day he tucked a red rose into my book of poems. "So you won't forget me on rainy days," he said with a grin. That rose is still there, brittle now, its petals darkened by time, but it carries his fingerprints. I still open the book sometimes, and when I do, the past spills out like perfume. Love between us wasn't sudden or dramatic. It was slow and patient, like bread rising. He taught me to whistle with 2 fingers. I taught him how dandelions, when flattened, smelled faintly of church hymnals. We learned the silence of holding hands, the weight of shared laughter, the comfort of simply being. The world outside Booneville was shifting. News traveled into town folded inside newspapers, words like Vietnam, communism, advisors. At first, it sounded like distant thunder. But by the time we were finishing high school, the thunder had rolled closer. Men were being drafted. Some came back in uniforms. Some didn't come back at all. Mike left for basic training in '66. We were barely out of school. But by then, our promise wasn't just something whispered by Aunt Loretta. It was ours. We had a plan, a porch swing, a magnolia tree in the yard, maybe children with freckles just like his. The night before he shipped out, he held me under the street lamp near the diner, the one that flickered like it had secrets. He pressed his forehead to mine. "Eve," he whispered, his voice steady, but his hands trembling. "I'll come back. We'll finish the porch. I'll plant that magnolia you love. I promise you." I nodded because I believed him. Because when you've loved someone since childhood, promises feel stronger than history itself. But that night, when he slipped a folded note into my pocket before walking away, I didn't read it right away. I couldn't. When I finally did, it was just one line in his cramped handwriting. "Keep the rose safe and keep me safe in your prayers." I folded it back into my book beside the rose. It's still there. It always will be. Conflict 1, the first hard thing between us, was not battle. It was the idea that our life could be parceled out to other people's schedules. My parents fretted and argued about money and about a young man's duty to his country. Aunt Loretta sent knitting needles and prayer shawls and told me to be strong, as if strength was an on-off switch. The town offered gestures, casseroles left on our doorstep, a pie from the pastor's wife, a handshake that lasted too long. They meant well, but sometimes well feels like a county fair prize, pretty and small. You might expect me to say that our solution was heroic. It wasn't. We wrote each other letters. We learned the language of envelopes. It sounds small, I know, but consider this. In the empty spaces where we could not touch, we made meaning with ink. I kept every letter folded in the back of an old cedar chest. He wrote in a cramped hand, sometimes on the backs of official forms. He sent me a pressed clover once, yellowed and still smelling faintly of the places he'd walked. I kept it between the pages of a book he loved. I sat sometimes and smelled it, and the smell would trick my heart into thinking the room was full of him. So the first conflict, who our lives belonged to, settled into a kind of compromise. He would serve, I would hold. He would be faithful to his duties, I would be faithful to the porch and the magnolia tree, and to the letters filled with small domestic promises. It was not a grand victory. It was just a choice. We chose each other, even in other people's plans.
Chapter 2. The Departure. Docks, Fog, and Promises. Picture the dock with me. It wasn't grand like in the movies. It was just our little harbor, where cargo ships sometimes creaked like old giants and gulls argued over scraps. That morning in 1967, the sky was the pale gray of old bone. Fog curled around the pier like a shawl, muting the world. No brass bands, no speeches, just families huddled close, trying to memorize faces before time tore them away. Mike's uniform looked too stiff, too big, as though the fabric didn't yet know how to belong to him. He had a duffel slung over his shoulder and a stick of gum in his pocket, his nervous habit. His fingers kept tracing the seam of his collar. He was performing bravery, and I was pretending to believe it. That's a different kind of courage, you know. The kind that requires pretending for each other. He pulled me close. His breath carried salt and peppermint. "Eve," he murmured, "I'll come back. We'll build the porch. I'll fix the old swing. I'll plant your magnolia." He smiled, but it was crooked, like the smile of a boy trying to hold back fear. I wanted to believe him. I needed to. My hands were cold, but I gripped his anyway, as if the pressure of my fingers could keep him tethered. The ship's horn bellowed then, a deep, mournful sound that made the planks beneath us tremble. Time didn't slow like in the movies. It rushed, greedy and unkind. He kissed me quickly, urgently, and then turned away. His boots clattered against the gangway as he became another name on a manifest. The ship moved with indifference. Engines roared, gulls followed, and the water foamed with a wake that looked too alive for such a deadening moment. Families stood silent on the dock, waving long after the ship was just a smudge against the fog. My father placed his heavy hand on my shoulder. He didn't say much, he never did, but his silence was steady, like stone. Chapter 3. Letters that stopped. The things that happen while you sleep. Letters are bridges. They stretch over oceans and jungles and months of silence. But bridges are fragile. They can hold the weight of longing only for so long before they crack under absence. At first, his letters came steady like heartbeat. Once every week, sometimes twice. Then gaps began to stretch. A week turned into 2, then 3. And with each gap, my own heart became a drum of dread. The first time a letter didn't arrive on schedule, I blamed the post office. The second time, I blamed the monsoon rains he had written about. But the third time, there was nothing left to blame except the war itself. Silence is the cruelest weapon. It makes widows before death has even been confirmed. When his letters did arrive, they were different. Shorter, sharper, like someone writing while holding their breath. Entire sentences had been blacked out by censors, sometimes entire pages. His words had once been filled with small details: the taste of coffee, the sound of cicadas at night. Now they carried only fragments. "Eve, we went out again. The jungle is alive, and yet it feels like a coffin. The air is thick, and every step sounds too loud. I sleep with my hand on my rifle. I don't tell the boys I'm scared. We laugh to keep the fear out. But when I close my eyes, I see you. I see Booneville. I see the rose in your book. Don't let it fade. If I don't make it back, promise me you'll keep it safe. It's the one piece of me the war can't take." I read that letter until the paper thinned in my hands.
I pressed the rolls harder between the book's pages, whispering, "You're safe here with me." But then came the last letter. It arrived weeks late, the envelope torn, the ink smeared. I could still smell the jungle in it. Smoke, mud, something metallic. My hands trembled as I opened it. His words were rushed, uneven, as if written in snatches between gunfire. "Eve, things are bad. I can't write much. We lost good men last night. The jungle doesn't sleep. It breathes, it watches, it waits. Every shadow feels like eyes. I keep my rose pressed in my Bible, right against my heart. When bullets fly, I hold on to it. When mortars fall, I whisper your name. If anything happens," and then the word stopped.
There are two kinds of grief in a small town. One is communal, the kind that gets carried in casseroles and pies and whispered prayers at church, and neighbors mowing your lawn without asking. The other is private, the kind that lives in your chest like a second heartbeat and shows up in the middle of the night when the house is too quiet. I carried both. For a while, Booneville carried me. People dropped off food I didn't eat. Women sat with me, knitting in silence as if their presence alone could stitch up the hole inside me. Men tipped their hats, their eyes soft with pity. Even children seemed gentler when they passed me in the street, like they knew without being told that I had been marked by something irreversible. But after a time, weeks, then months, people wanted the story to end. Booneville wanted my grief to be tidy. They wanted me to close the book, put the rose away, and move on. "Evelyn, you're still so young," they'd say, voices thick with good intentions. "You'll find someone else. That's what Michael would have wanted." Do you know how cruel that phrase is? That's what he would have wanted. As if anyone but me could decide what he wanted. As if promises made under magnolia trees could be rewritten by neighbors over pie. The porch of my family home became a symbol. It was half built when Michael left. We'd started it with our own hands one summer, hammering nails, measuring planks, laughing when boards didn't line up straight. "We'll finish it after I'm back," he had promised, brushing sawdust from my hair. After his death, the porch stayed unfinished. A skeleton of wood, planks weathering in the sun, nails rusting in the rain. People passing by would shake their heads. Some pitied me. Some thought it was stubbornness. To me, it was neither. It was memory, standing in plain sight, reminding me that life had been interrupted mid-construction. Then came the suitors. George Haynes was first. He owned the feed store. A good man, kind, steady. He came by with baskets of apples, his eyes soft with patience. One evening he stood on my porch, our unfinished porch, and said, "Evelyn, you don't have to be alone forever. I could make a home with you." His voice cracked with sincerity, and I almost said yes. Not out of love, but out of exhaustion, out of the weight of being pitied. But then, behind his words, I heard Michael's laughter, the way he used to whistle when he was hammering nails.
and my throat closed. I told George no. He looked wounded, but he understood. Others followed. A widower from the next county, a teacher who wrote me long, polite letters about companionship, even a traveling salesman who thought I'd be grateful for his attention. Booneville's women whispered that I was foolish, a pretty girl wasting her youth, they'd say. Men said I was loyal to a ghost. Both were true in a way. But here is the heart of the third conflict. It wasn't just about men. It was about loyalty versus survival. Every morning, I woke up and asked myself, do I betray him by moving on, or do I betray myself by staying? Which betrayal can I live with? I chose him. I chose the rose in the book, the half-built porch, the magnolia tree that still hadn't been planted. Some nights when the moonlight spilled over the wood beams of the unfinished porch, I'd sit there with his letters spread out before me. I'd read them aloud softly, as though speaking them back into the world could bridge the gap. Sometimes I even answered them, writing letters addressed to Mike and folding them into my cedar chest. It sounds mad, I know, but grief has its own logic, and mine demanded conversation. One letter I wrote but never sent read, Mike, the porch is still waiting. I can hear the boards creak when the wind hits just right. Booneville thinks I'm foolish for waiting. Maybe I am, but if I move on, then the promise dies. And I can't let it die, because if the promise dies, then what was all this for? I wait, even if waiting is all I ever do. Yours, Eve. Sometimes I wondered if I was punishing myself, if clinging to the rose, the porch, the letters was just another way of staying broken. But then I'd open his Bible and find the rose still pressed inside, still intact after jungles and gunfire, and I knew I wasn't just clinging, I was keeping him alive. Years passed. Aunt Loretta died quietly in her sleep, leaving me her hat pins and her stubborn faith that Michael would always be with us somehow. Booneville changed. New shops opened, old ones closed. Friends married, had children, grew gray. I remained, Evelyn who waited. Some pitied me. Some admired me. Most just accepted me, like a landmark. And still, the porch stood unfinished. It became more than wooden nails. It became my declaration, my resistance, my reminder to the world that love is not always neat, not always replaceable, not always something you can set aside when the calendar flips. People call me sentimental. Maybe they were right. But I'll tell you this, sentiment is just another word for refusing to let go. And I refused.
Chapter 5. The Waiting Room. Now, most days, I sit by my window and watch Booneville move. The restaurant across the street has a new owner. The kids from the high school hang around near the park and speak in the language of the new century, a language with words I sometimes have to look up in my head. I still set 2 plates when I make stew, out of habit mostly. Don't laugh. Habits are lodgings for the heart. Sometimes people ask me why I never remarried. They ask it with apologies built into the question. I answer plainly, because I promised. They nod.
That's an acceptable answer. If they pressed, I would tell them that sometimes the idea of holding a promise is what keeps your own story coherent. I haven't been lonely every day. Loneliness, like grace, comes and goes. I have had dreams where the shore looks different, and my porch swing finally creaks beneath two bodies. In those dreams, we talk like we used to, and the details of the world either make sense or melt away into something like eternity. I wake up with the taste of his letters in my mouth. The cedar chest remains. The photograph is still there. Its edges have yellowed. The clover is gone now, decayed into the dust of years, but the exact place where he once pressed it into cardboard is still slightly marked. I promised I would give you a lens. Let us put on a particular pair of glasses for this final stretch. I want you to read the story through the lens of memory as a form of resistance. Not resistance to politics, resistance to erasure. The world is quick to file away losses. It's efficient that way. But memory is stubborn. It keeps an account that no ledger could ever measure. Through this lens, my waiting is not merely a refusal of life. It is also, and perhaps more importantly, a refusal to let the story of a small life be swallowed up by the industrial appetite of warfare. Every letter I keep is a protest. Every time I tell this story, I am refusing to let him be reduced to a column in a paper. There is another angle, too, the ethics of promises. In Booneville, a promise is a social artifact. It matters who makes them and why. When governments call men to fight, they do so with the language of necessity and protection. Families back home read those phrases and try to make meaning. But when those men are killed, when a telegram arrives folded and cold, it raises a question. Who pays for the promises of nations? It is always ordinary people. The men in rooms with maps rarely lose daughters, nieces, or the smell of dandelions between their fingers. The ones who tend the porches are the ones who receive the checks and the condolences. So if I'm being blunt, I will say the moral is not just that war brings destruction. It is that countries, for reasons wrapped in strategy and power, send away the living and expect the living to bear the losses with polite gratitude. That is an injustice. I hold that for you plainly, without theatrics. I don't want to be carried by a tide of rhetorical fury. I believe in facts. Facts are simple. A boy left, a woman waited, letters kept going, the world did not stop. The moral, the thing I want pressed into the pages of our small town's history, is this: war takes. It takes first the young, then the quiet ones who loved them, and then it tries to take their stories. In that chain, countries secure their interests, and families pick up the pieces. It is ugly when you say it like that. It is uglier when you think about what counts as interest for someone in a room far away. And here's the last part of the lens: memory as tenderness. I have not been mean in my waiting. I've been faithful. I have loved. I have been generous in my days. I raised children in my own way. I taught. I planted. Being faithful did not mean shriveling. It meant that all the other things I did had an extra sweetness because I carried a promise along the edge of them. It made me tender with other people's grief. It gave me a vocabulary for consolation. The final image I want you to keep is small and ordinary. It's a porch swing, half painted. We never finished because there was always something else to spend money on. The magnolia I said he would plant, it grew taller than both of us, and every spring it covers the porch in white, in the way of a blessing. People pass and say, "Evelyn, you kept the light on too long." And I say, "I kept it on purpose." They smile politely, and then they move along. If I'm honest with you, and I am always when I'm telling you a story, I still expect sometimes that one morning there'll be a shoe on the step, and the knuckles will knock like rain, and a voice will say, "Eve." That's foolishness. I know that. It's also entirely human. I haven't married. I don't know if I'll get to see him again the way some people imagine, all golden light and chorus. I only know that I have been a custodian of a promise, and that in itself has been both armor and softening for me. I have taught my children to value promises. I have told them, when they were small, that the world will ask for a lot, and sometimes for the most dear things, and that you have to decide what you will give in return. They watch me like that old dog I used to own who always seemed to know when I needed company. My son, Henry, calls every Sunday and asks about the garden. My daughter, Mabel, brings flowers and refuses to let me stop laughing at some new joke she insists I must hear. Before I finish, and I will finish now because stories need an end even if lives do not, let me return to the hook I promised at the beginning. If you remember one thing from this long account, let it be this. Wars are efficient at making small, private promises vanish into the machinery of state. They do this for reasons that sound like history and strategy. I want you to remember the people who are left to pick up the pieces. I want you to measure policies by the number of small porches they leave unpainted. It's a pretty metric, isn't it? Less glamorous than charts, but it tells you where life actually lives. If you ask me if I am angry, I can be. A woman is allowed to be. I am also stubbornly still in love. I am also, more than anything else, tired and patient. There is a chair on my porch with a cushion that fits my shape. I sit there most evenings. I watch the sun run its route across the town. I sip tea. I talk to him sometimes, the way the living talk to the impossible. The town calls me sentimental. I call myself steady. When my time comes, and it will, what I will do is simple. I will fold the telegram's language back into my chest and walk toward whatever waits with my letters in my hand. I will go with the knowledge that I did what I could with what I had. I will go because promises, even broken ones, have weight. They tug. They pull. They tell you where to lay down your hat. So now you know my story. You know my name. You know how a small town girl makes a life out of scraps and vows. And if you remember nothing else, remember this. Wars build monuments of names and forgets the knitting of people's days. It will always be easier for those who never had to patch the porch to say, "It's for the greater good." But there is no greater good that should cost us all of our tender things. Good night, then. If you pass Booneville, Look up at the house with the unpainted porch and the magnolia that blooms like a stubborn yes.